Indeed, indeed. Faith is that victory that overcomes the world. Amen?
Amen.
Well, tonight we are in the book of Judges again. This is our 12th in this particular series. We're going to try and pick up where we ended last week. Going to give you a little bit of a review. We ended up last week just reminding you again that we've looked at, and this is our fifth judge. We've looked at Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, Deborah, and now Gideon. And we've already looked at the fact, too, of just, again, the outline. The judge is, as we stated, Gideon, the children of Israel. We know what they have done. They have done evil in the sight of the Lord. They've been oppressed. Now they have cried unto the Lord, and he has sent them a deliverer. Before he sent them a deliverer, he sent them an oppressor. The oppressor were the Midianites. Along with the Midianites, you had also the Amalekites, as well as the children of the east. The chronology is you had 7 years of oppression. And if you remember the oppression, it was not a constant state of oppression like some nations would do, but actually they would sweep through the most fertile areas of Israel, and they would strip Israel of their harvest. They would take everything. So basically they had nothing unless, like we find with Gideon, that he was hiding in a wine press, and that's why that they had to do that. The application will go on as we follow through some of these, and that'll make a difference of whether or not how far we get. We've already looked at the cycle of sin. We talked about the call of Gideon last week, and we almost got finished with the casting down. And then we'll look at the clippings of wool, or the fleece, of course, the test that was there. And we're going to get started with verse 32 just as a reminder. Take us back to where we finished. Therefore, on that day, and that day is the fact of when Gideon had gone in and torn down the altar of Baal. He had cut down the groves. He had built an altar to Jehovah and sacrificed one of the 2 oxen that he had on that particular location that was there. Therefore, on that day, he called him Jerubbaal, because if you remember, the townsmen, the people that were there, came out and said, "Who tore this down?" Found out it was Gideon. He's got to die. Well, therefore, on that day, Jerubbaal, they called him Jerubbaal, which means let Baal plead. And that's exactly it, because he had thrown down his altar. It's interesting to note that here are a group of men who are seeking his death, but eventually they will seek his elevation to be their leader. They will seek not only him, but they'll even later ask for his son and his son's sons to rule over them. Seems like quite a change of heart. But while this revival we mentioned about and talked about, just like here, while the revival is taking place, the enemy begins to gather. The enemy is trying to disrupt the change of mind and heart of the children of Israel. God heard their cries, God saw their weeping, and he raised up Gideon to deliver them. So that's why we're going to be looking here at this. Again, when we look at the outline, the chapter, we remember the revival, we remember the antagonists, the Midianites, and how awful they were, and how awful life was. I don't know how you and I, we just get, it's too easy. We can just walk a few feet, and we've got a refrigerator. You know, yeah, it's pleasant, it's easy, and probably some of you can walk a few more feet to another room and you've got a freezer, a big one, where you got other food stored up in there. I can remember my mother being able to, if we had a visiting preacher that would come to the house or come to the church, either way, that within 20 minutes she could have a full spread on the table, and that was coming out of the fridge or the freezer because she had enough stuff that she'd always have there. You don't have that these days. And if you didn't get your full harvest, you're going to have a problem. These guys were stealing everything for 7 years. But this year, everything changes. Everything changes this year. So that's where we're going to start. Verse 33, the enemies gathered, then all the Midianites and the Amalekites and the children of the east were gathered together and went over and pitched in the valley of Jezreel. Now you have to remember, this is a huge army. They are well equipped. We're going to read later that it talks about their camels being like the sand of the sea. There's so many of them. But it's also something else that we're going to see in verse 34, that at the same time that you have the enemy gathering, that Satan moves upon them, the Spirit is going to move upon Gideon in verse 34. But the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, and he blew a trumpet, and Abiezer was gathered after him. Now remember, that's the town, that's the area in which he lived. So again, the same men that previously were angered by him now respond to his call. Think about this, to fight a force that outnumbers them. But they don't hesitate. The Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon and he acted. Now, that's the way we ought to be. Looking for the Spirit of the Lord to move upon us. The enemies gather, so what? The Spirit moves upon Gideon. This is why he acted the way that he acted. He called for the men to arm themselves and to gather together to fight these superior forces and stop the locusts, the human locusts, from stripping our land. What does he do next? Verse 35, and he sent messengers throughout all Manasseh, who also was gathered after him, and he sent messengers unto Asher and unto Zebulun and unto Naphtali, and they came up to meet him. Again, when the enemy gathers, we need men full of the Spirit and moved by God to call us to battle and to step up to the fight, even if we know we are outnumbered. Now look at how small we are. We are a small group. As far as I know, we've always been a small group. But it really doesn't matter. In fact, we're going to see that as we look through this lesson tonight. Hopefully we'll get far enough along into it. But it's just something, again, that God would move upon us to step up and be ready to fight, even though we are outnumbered. Really, that sounds like Christian living in California today. We are outnumbered, terribly outnumbered. But we can fight the unnumbered foe, knowing that we have the weapons, the spiritual weapons, and the armor of the Lord to do battle and be a superior force. But it does require commitment and courage. This isn't pretend. It's real battle. It is a real fight. The enemies are real. The numbers are obvious. Again, I could say, look how small in number we are. Look how old we are. Look how weak we are. It's okay. It really is okay. Watch what happens in this whole story. Watch this story unfold. We all know this story. It's not going to be like a surprise to you, but it should be an encouragement to see how God tells us this story and how he uses small forces with mighty acts of divine power. Now, all of a sudden, from verse 35 to 36, the whole story will change focus. Gideon is now going to direct his conversation to God. So verse 36, and Gideon, where we now come to I call it the clippings of wool, or the fleece of wool that you remember. And Gideon said unto God, if thou wilt save Israel by my hand. Now remember, they're up on the edge of the valley. They've gathered together. No doubt they've had scouts go down and look and see, and the numbers are there. He's got what they call 32,000 men. That's a pretty good force. But he's looking at fighting 135,000. So you've only got a third of the number. And they've got better weapons, they've got their camels, they've got other things that are there. And Gideon said, I think he's looking at this and he might have a little bit of question. Gideon said unto God, if thou wilt save Israel by my hand, as thou hast said, behold, I will put a fleece of wool in the floor. And if the dew be on the fleece only, and it be dry upon all the earth beside, then shall I know that thou wilt save Israel by my hand, as thou hast said. So he does a little test, doesn't he? Now, again, we'll look at this and we'll go, oh, poor Gideon. Poor Gideon, you've done the same thing. We've all done the same thing. We've had our own test. We've proved God. We've done that same thing. And notice what happens in verse 38. And it was so, for he rose up early on the morrow. I wonder why he got up early. I think he was excited. I think he wanted to see. I think he wanted to know, did this happen or not? He rose up early on the morrow and thrust the fleece together. He pulled it up and he wringed the dew out of the fleece, a bowl full of water. Wow, how interesting again. I don't know how big the bowl was, but I don't think it was a little cereal bowl. I think it was something that, again, would give him the confidence to be sure of God's call. But let's ask, is this doubt? Is this faith having a problem? Or is it a want for divine confirmation? I will ask this too. Is it asked in private? Or is it asked in front of others? Remember, he's got all these men that have gathered to him. He's got others that are more local with just him. Is this for himself or as a witness? Or is this just him saying, I really need to know? Maybe it's a little of all of them. Maybe it's a little bit, I believe, but help thou my unbelief. Is this a prayer, a petition, or is it spoken to the angel of the Lord? Gideon was very straightforward with his request and why he was asking it. It's kind of like, again, Lord, if you're really going to use me to lead me into battle, to be the deliverer, to be the judge, I need a sign of confirmation. It could be, too, that he's asking, is this for right now? Are we moving out at this very moment? Lord, are you wanting me to step up? They're gathered together. Are you wanting me to go engage them right now? And of course, God answered his prayer. God made it abundantly clear. I think very clear. The point of the water filling the bowl is certainly the sign. Because again, no water anywhere else but on the wool. But then all of a sudden in verses 39 through 40, we see Gideon's forward petition. By forward, I mean that he's really presuming upon God. In fact, he is a bit brazen. You know that because before he even asks, he apologizes for asking. What is he saying? Gideon said unto God, let not thine anger be hot against me, and I will speak but this once. Let me prove, that's the word test, let me prove, I pray thee, but this once with the fleece. Well, you already did that. But he wants to do it again, once with the fleece. Let it now be dry. Only upon the fleece and upon all the ground let there be dew. And God did so that night, for it was dry upon the fleece only, and there was dew on all the ground. Kyle and Delitzsch, in their comments on this, said Gideon's prayer did not arise from a want of faith, but from the weakness of the flesh. And I think that's accurate. I think we need to see that as ourselves. A lot of times our faith is strong, but remember where you do battle is in your flesh. And your flesh is going to fight you. Remember what Galatians says, that the flesh is contrary to the spirit, so that you cannot do the things that you would. That means to even walk by faith, a lot of times the flesh is going to try and fault you. More is said about his apology than in this design sign. And in the design sign, you see, he made it exactly the opposite of what he had asked before. Why? For obvious reasons. To dispel any idea of trickery, ideal weather conditions, or any other thing that somebody could come up with, like, well, you could find some fault in it. No, he makes it exactly the opposite. Gideon knew the job was beyond his ability to do. He knew the job was beyond his ability to even organize and lead. So he needed this confirmation. I'll just ask you, how's your faith? Is it perfect? Or is it needy and weak? You ever find yourself saying this? I know God can, but I don't know if God will. How many of us say that? Here's where our doubt runs into. Or even if God wants to. Maybe we need to study his prayer a little bit more. And again, notice his first request of this prayer is really not for a sign. His first request is, let not thine anger be hot against me. Gideon knew his request was excessive. He knew that his request was demanding. He knew it was testing God, that it sought to prove God and his promise, and it did certainly try God. Yet, God did exactly what he asked. So if that's the case, then he prayed within God's will, didn't he? Hello? Yes, he did. If God answered it, he prayed according to God's will. Again, just as the enemy is gathering in the valley ready to attack, the flesh is already attacking, the personal conflict has begun, and that teaches us that a lot of times we are going to have conflict, and we need to prepare in prayer. It causes us to look and understand that a lot of times there is going to be a struggle even in our prayer. How can we know if we do not ask for the best or the greatest, or for our prayers to be the most imaginative? Gideon, if you notice again, he didn't add anything. He just said, if you are really wanting me to do this, then give me this confirmation. But we have to remember that God tells us that he will answer above what we ask or think. Doesn't he? In Ephesians 3:20, now unto him that is able to do exceeding abundantly above. Right? Well, it's going to get even greater when we start looking at this story. If this is simply a matter of doubt, then we can learn that God is compassionate to the weakest of faith or the thickest in the head. Sometimes it just doesn't click. Let's go right into chapter 7. This is the sifting of Gideon's army. He goes from verse 1 to verse 18. Of course, we can break it down a little bit more. But the trump has been blown. The men of the tribes have gathered. Gideon has had his sign of confirmation, and they are ready to do battle. Verse 1. Then Jerubbaal, who is Gideon, and all the people that were with him, rose up early and pitched beside the well of Harod, so that the host of the Midianites were on the north side of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley. Now the geographical points can be argued, somewhat lost, but we do know that they pitched where they could prepare to enter battle quickly against the hordes of the Midianites. I've got a little map that gives you a little bit of a picture of where they probably were, and you can see in the blue is the Midianite army, and the size of it gives you a little bit of general look at it. In the valley of Jezreel there, a little bit further back, you see that Gideon's men, and that's about as accurate as I can get it, but it shows the general area. And again, 32,000 Israelites. You get that from chapter 7, verse 3. 135,000 Midianites. That comes from chapter 8, verse 10. You'll see it, because when it talks about after this battle, there's going to be about 15,000 of them still living. And we learn that 120,000 of them died in that other battle. So he's looking out over the scene. And I don't know about you, but even if you believe and have the greatest of faith, you're still going to look and you're going to wonder, all right, how is this going to happen? We're such a small force, so poorly aimed compared to them and their camels. We got swords, well, got a good-sized force, but isn't going to last. While wondering these possibilities and thinking about how he would direct his men, his 32,000 men, all of a sudden we read in verse 2, the Lord said unto Gideon, the people that are with thee are too many. Wow, wait a minute. They're too many for me to give the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel vault themselves against me, saying, mine own hand hath saved me. Now, pay attention to that, because you get a lot of speculation about this chapter. But pride is the most devastating enemy that you and I will fight. And it's the most debilitating. God is going to begin to reveal his plan. And he's telling Gideon the number needs to be drawn down to prevent pride from taking over and vaunting themselves. Really, it's a matter of boasting themselves by embellishing their story of victory. And you know what? A lot of people do that. A lot of people like to embellish. Yeah. They needed worse odds. They needed worse odds? Yes, they did. Less likelihood of winning. That's what we need. God was preparing Gideon to have nothing left but faith. That's what he's doing. They needed, again, like I said, worse odds. He and his men need to see the impossibility of the task. Folks, you and I have an impossible task. We are set here to evangelize California, a wicked state, one that's backwards on nearly everything. People that we live amongst that do not think like us. They do not talk like us. They do not plan like us. They do not hope like us. Well, God doesn't want us to have any faith in the flesh. So he begins to narrow it down and shrink the army. Verse 3. Now therefore, he says, go to, proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, whosoever is fearful and afraid, let him return and depart early for Mount Gilead. Okay, there is your first test. And there returned to the people 22,000, and there remained 10,000. 22,000 men said, yep, we're afraid, and they hightailed it back home. Fear is certainly a terrible thing for any army to be filled with. It can be a deadly, infectious attitude. But fear can be overcome. In this, God used this fear to filter out the men that he would not use. Again, more than half of the force went home. 2/3 of it left. All that remained, were they brave and ready and willing to fight with such overwhelming odds? They seemed to be. Yet God then speaks again to Gideon. Now, God could have used any means of separating the men from one another down to a number that he wanted in just one act. He could have given Gideon the names. But he chose it to do it this way for a reason. And it demonstrates something to us. It teaches us lessons. One lesson it teaches us is that we cannot be too small or too weak for God to use. But apparently we can be too big and too strong. Now, which would you rather be? Weak and small or big and strong? I'd rather be big and strong. But God says, no, we want you weak and small. So God now gives Gideon a partial command. God doesn't tell Gideon all the information he's going to need to finish the thinning, but he will after he obeys this first part. Think again about our being faithful in little things. Sometimes you may not know what God's plans are. Just learn to be faithful even in the little things. Then you can learn how to be faithful in the big things. Let's look at verse 4. And the Lord said unto Gideon, the people are yet too many. Whoa! From 22,000 down to 10,000, and yet this is too many. So what I want you to, now, again, 10,000. Bring them down to the water, and I will try them there. And it shall be that of whom I say unto thee, notice he doesn't say what he's going to do yet. He just tells him, whom I say unto thee, this shall go with thee, the same shall go with thee. And of whomsoever I say unto thee shall not go with thee, the same shall not go. So he knows, again, he's going to get the group thinned out. So he's going to make another division, and he's going to do it by an action rather than an attitude. The first was an attitude, fear. But now we're going to get an action that God's going to use to divide. So he brought down the people under the water. So remember again, all he told them was, I'm going to bring you down to the water, and then I'm going to... So the first thing what he had to do, he says, all right, boys, we're all going down to the water. Now he gets down there, and he says, the Lord said, everyone that... Tell everybody to get a drink. And the Lord said unto Gideon, everyone that lappeth of the water with his tongue, as a dog lappeth, him shalt thou set by himself. Likewise, everyone that boweth down upon his knees to drink. So you can see there's a division of the way that they are drinking. Now, the act of drinking in these two matters, it can reveal to us a readiness or a cautiousness in battle. You know, it's like we need to reset the scene and remember they were at this well of Herod. Some say that these springs were in view of the Midianites, so that these men, first of all, they would all have to have courage then to go get a drink because they're going to be seen by the Midianites, if that's the case. So these men would have had enough courage to go down and drink, but how they drink now makes a difference. Some of these men took their eyes off the enemy or off the valley as they were getting down and drinking. Others were picking the water up and keeping their eyes either on Gideon or on the valley and drinking and being careful. They were keeping their focus. They were being careful. Let's look, and the number of them that lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, were 300. I'm sure Gideon at that point said, well, that's not too bad. Lose 300. Out of 10,000, we still got 9,700. Oops, that's not the case. The number of them that lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, were 300 men, but all the rest of the people bowed down upon their knees to drink. And the Lord said unto Gideon, by 300, remember 135,000? Camels like you can't believe, looked like locusts upon the ground, and now God says, by 300 men that lapped will I save you, and deliver the Midianites into their hand, and let all the other people go, every man unto his place. Gideon has now reduced his army by 99%. Wow, there's your army. Wow, we've lost a lot of people. Through death, through merging, through moving away, all kinds of other things. Listen, we've lost a lot of people. Is God whittling us down to get us ready to do the fight, to battle? So what happens in verse 8? The people took their victuals, that's their supplies, in their hand and their trumpets, and sent all the rest of Israel, every man into his tent, and retained those 300 men, and the host of Midian was beneath him in the valley. Now, I would say many of the commentators and preachers will tell us that those ones that were removed were men that God couldn't use. I don't think that's the case. They will even say that God can't use men who are not alert, who feared. I will say that could be true, but I believe God can use anyone, even the weakest of vessels. And be careful about saying, well, those who fear, we could just dismiss them immediately, because you're going to learn a little bit later that Gideon feared. Imagine what Gideon did. Wait a minute. I feared. How come I don't get to go home? But he didn't. I think that they were just simply two means of dividing the men and getting them down to a number where, again, pride could not be an issue after the victory. Again, pride is the attitude that has no place in the work of our God. Our work will be accomplished by God and by his empowering and using us in the way that he sees fit. It is the very reason that God said he was going to thin out the ranks. I need to get rid of some men so that you will not be proud and say and boast or vaunt yourself and say, look what we've done. It gets down to it. We can look back in the history of our church and certain things that I have used that we have accomplished a task that we knew was beyond our ability. There was no way we could do it. But God did. And God accomplished that. So there's no fear of pride in us because there was nothing left. We know it wasn't us. These men grabbed their supplies and their trumpets. Wait, where's the weapons? So the people took victuals in their hand and their trumpets. Where's the swords? Don't you remember something about the sword of Gideon? But we don't see it just yet. And he sent all the rest of the Israelite men to his own tent and retained those 300 men. All right. Verse 9, and it came to pass the same night that the Lord said unto him, arise, get thee down unto the host, for I have delivered it into thy hand. 300 men, let's go, let's fight. Wow. The promise that I gave you is going to be carried out right now. Get going. Get down into that valley where the enemy is camped. And again, if you'll notice the surety in that last phrase, for I have, not I will. I have delivered it into thine hand. But I want to get to this next verse. I'm going a little off, a little over, but verse 10. But if thou fear. Remember what I said a while ago? These guys were all afraid. So people will say, well, we need to get rid of all the people that are fearful. You can overcome fear. You really can. You can teach and preach on it. God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of sound mind and love. I mean, there's something to that. And he made a provision for Gideon. This is a word to him. But if thou fear to go down, go thou with Hurrah, thy servant, to the host. Now this again goes against the idea that God doesn't use men who fear. Fear can be infectious, but it can be overcome. Gideon is given confidence and his fear is overcome. thine hands will be strengthened. So look at what he does. And thou shalt hear what they say. And afterward shall thine hands be strengthened to go down into the host. Then went he down with Uriah. What does that tell you? That means that he feared. He was afraid. So he went down with Uriah, his servant, on the outside of the armed men that were in the host. Gideon would then hear some of what the Midianites are saying. The Spirit would empower him to go down into the host to fight them. But he does go down with his servant, which apparently is the source of his encouragement and his strength. God will help you if you have fear to overcome your fear. And he will supply you with something or somebody to encourage you. Again, that means Gideon did fear, but he found the strength with this man, his servant, to obey and lead his men. Verse 12, the sight is the same. The unnumbered host, all of those camels are in that valley. It's amazing. Nothing has changed except the man. And the Midianites and the Amalekites and all the children of the east lay along in the valley like grasshoppers for multitude. And their camels were without number as the sand of the sea for the multitude. All of these three groups of marauders now filled this valley along with their camels. It is an amazing, fearful sight. But we have a man of faith, Gideon, leading 300 chosen men of God. It does not, again, I'm going to say, make it very clear, it is not what those men could or couldn't do that made the difference. It was God. And God is wanting to make sure of the men that he is using. The Midianites, the Amalekites, and the children of the east will not take another harvest from Israel. We're going to stop there because the next goes into the barley cake, and I want to wait for that. In fact, I want to tell you, hopefully, I have not been able to figure it out yet. I've been looking for barley and to make barley cakes just for the fact that we could have barley cakes on Wednesday night so you'd know what a barley cake even is. It's very hard to find barley, and you can't find any bakery making barley cakes, but it will be interesting nonetheless if we can. But the dream of the barley cake comes up next week, and we'll pick on that as we begin our study again and get then into what happens in the battle against the